nation will endure as it has endured.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
Hello, welcome back to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Cidello.
It is good to be back after a couple of weeks off, and there's plenty to catch up on too.
Biden's poll numbers are getting worse as Democrats haggle over their spending plan.
And we're going to talk to a Republican pollster about what that could mean. Plus, look at rising tensions between the US and China over Taiwan.
And we're going to have the latest COVID news, Trump's unofficial comeback campaign, and we'll bust some malarkey as well. But first...
And first is to Capitol Hill, where Democrats are squabbling over what should be in and out of their massive social spending bill, which is suddenly not quite as massive as it once was. Long touted as a $3.5 trillion bill, President Biden has made it clear there'll more likely be a 2 in front of it. Some moderate Democrats want to see a 1 instead, and Republicans want to see a 0. They've dealt themselves out. But either way, the fight is on between Democrats over what from their various wish lists is going to make the final cut. And it is down to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to try and temper expectations all round.
The fact is that if there are fewer dollars to spend, there are choices to be made. And members have said, let's get the results that we need, but we will not diminish the transformative nature of what it is.
Meanwhile, Republicans like Rand Paul are making hay, exaggerating what might be in the bill.
People are saying, we're going to give you free college, free cars, free cell phones, free this, free that. Everything in life will be free. You won't have to work anymore. The problem is there are ramifications. Money doesn't grow on trees. The money's got to come from somewhere.
A quick fact check on that. True, money does not grow on trees, but even at $3.5 trillion, nobody is saying that everything will be free and you won't have to work anymore. And in the meantime, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which Democrats have stalled, hoping its passage will run in tandem with the social spending bill, has become something of a hostage to the process. It is all getting pretty messy, and they only have a couple of weeks to try and untangle it until they meet a deadline that they set for themselves, Chaz, at the start of November.
Yeah, because that's when the Virginian governor's election is, and all this infighting is not helping the Democrat candidate there at all.
He needs a win.
He does, and the Democrats do too, because it's a blue state. So if they lose that race, that will really start them panicking. But getting this bill passed, not going to be easy. Firstly, there's the issue of the Hyde Amendment. Now, that's a provision that bans the government from funding abortion services. Joe Manchin insists on the Hyde Amendment being part of the reconciliation bill. He said, we're not taking the Hyde Amendment off, and the bill is dead on arrival if the Hyde Amendment is gone. In response, though, the leader of the House Progressive Caucus was quite blunt.
Can you vote for a bill that has the Hyde Amendment in it? No.
That's pretty unambiguous, and so is this from Bernie Sanders. He says that expanding Medicare coverage to dental and optical services must be included in the bill, and to him, it's not negotiable. Neither is it negotiable, apparently, to the House Progressive Caucus. But Joe Manchin says that we need to stabilise Medicare, and he insists on stabilising Medicare before voting to expand it. So that is another standoff. Remember, the numbers in the House and the Senate are so close, Democrats need all these people to agree on the final bill. Even more frustrating to the Democrats, 83% of Americans favour allowing the federal government to negotiate with drug companies to get a lower price on prescription drugs. When presented arguments in favour of and opposed to drug price negotiation, the number of people favouring negotiation remained the same, despite the arguments. In fact, Americans rejected the pharmaceutical companies' argument that they need higher drug prices to pay for research and development. They rejected that by 93% to 6%. So this is a dream policy for the Dems. They've all been campaigning on it for decades. They can almost taste it, and Kirsten Sinema is opposed to it. One senator. Why? No one knows. She won't say. But the bill can't get up without her. So this has driven Democratic activists over the edge. They've been hassling Sinema in airports, hassling her in planes, even hassling her in bathrooms. No answers yet, just lots of aggro on both sides. And by the way, the worst part is that Manchin and Sinema are demanding different concessions, both in terms of revenue and programs. So even just those two senators alone might not be able to come up with a bill they both like. And the deadline, as you say, John, 2 weeks.
Tick, 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 Chaz. And in the meantime, Senator Sinema has reportedly ducked off to Paris, France, to do a little bit of fundraising after being heckled everywhere she went in Washington by those angry progressives. Meanwhile, of course, Chaz, there is the little question of the debt ceiling, which allows the US government to increase borrowing to pay for what are existing spending commitments. And Republicans, led by Senator Mitch McConnell, have for weeks been saying they would not lift a finger to lift the debt limit, insisting it's up to Democrats to deal with it. But then finally, this week, a change of heart.
Top Republican Mitch McConnell offering Democrats a deal to allow the government to extend its ability to borrow money to pay its bills for another 2 months.
We view that as a victory. We view it as a temporary victory, though, with more work to do.
Very temporary and a lot more work to do. Speaker Pelosi has called on Republicans to now get fully behind the measure, which has always had previously bipartisan support, simply because the idea of America not paying its bills and going into default is just too catastrophic to contemplate.
If we don't lift the ceiling, it could be a loss of 6 million jobs, $15 trillion in household wealth, and drastically increase the cost. Do you have a credit card? Do you have a car loan? Car loans, mortgages, student loans, credit cards, and other borrowings.
Not only that, the White House also warns a default would see unemployment spike, GDP crash 4%, global credit markets freeze up, and stock markets around the world collapse. But Mitch McConnell says he's bailed the Democrats out once and they're happy to use reconciliation to go it alone on other things when it suits them, so why not do it now? He's not going to offer any Republican votes come December.
The majority didn't have a plan to prevent default, so we stepped forward. The pathway our Democratic colleagues have accepted will spare the American people any near-term crisis while definitively resolving the majority's excuse that they lacked time to address the debt limit through the 304 reconciliation process. Now there'll be no question they'll have plenty of time.
Plenty of time, but no Republican votes still. The political calculation therefore looks pretty obvious. Make Democrats solely responsible for increasing America's debt limit. Make it look like they're fiscally reckless when they're just paying for existing spending, a lot of it incurred under Donald Trump, by the way. And it will probably weigh on the minds of those moderate Democrats. It's a little bit, Chaz, like handing somebody a maxed out credit card bill just as they're about to go out the door and go shopping again.
Very much so. You know, even if Mitch McConnell wanted to help the Democrats out, which he doesn't, the other Republicans wouldn't let him anyway. Even the tiny concession that McConnell made to push back the debt ceiling crunch to December, that was met by a lot of grumbling from the people he leads. Trump wrote that it looks like Mitch McConnell was folding to the Democrats again. He's got all of the cards with the debt ceiling. It's time to play the hand. Don't let them destroy our country. Apparently the way you don't let the Democrats destroy the country is by pushing the country towards default. I don't know. Anyway, the Republicans aren't going to be helping the Democrats either way, which is a problem because the Dems really want to sort the debt ceiling issue out with a normal, regular bill, not through a partisan reconciliation bill. Why? Because through budget reconciliation, you're only allowed to raise the debt limit, not suspend it. So that means they'd have to come up with a specific dollar amount for the new debt ceiling, which Republicans, as John said, could then hang around their necks at election time. Whereas with a normal bipartisan bill, you can just suspend the debt ceiling for as long as you want. No scary debt numbers. That is the reason that Dems are so keen to get Republican help and avoid the reconciliation process. How do I know that? Because the Budget Committee chair just came right out and said it.
We can do it through reconciliation. Leadership has said they don't want to do that. The reason is if we do that through reconciliation, we actually have to specify a number.
And as always with Washington, you only hear the truth from someone who just announced that they're resigning next year. But to me, it seems like they're kidding themselves if they think a debt ceiling number is that big a deal in an election. But yeah, I'm not the one running for re-election. Easy for me to say. One other wrinkle though, it kind of suits the Democrats to push this right to the edge because reconciliation takes ages. And if they run out of time for reconciliation, then that would place a massive amount of pressure on Manchin and Sinema to reform the filibuster so they can pass this bill normally and quickly with 50 votes. It'd be basically an end run around Manchin and Sinema's filibuster support. Now, Manchin and Sinema would totally know that's what they're trying to do, so there's likely to be a lot of game playing going on with the debt ceiling all the way to December. And there dangles the fate of the American financial system.
Yeah, all these poker players thinking they're holding the winning hand. That's how somebody loses a lot of money, Chaz. President Biden's summer of disappointments, meanwhile, has turned into an autumn of discontent, with his poll numbers sliding to record lows on the back of the Delta COVID surge and the fall of Kabul. Towards the end of May, Joe Biden was sitting pretty on almost 55% approval, with just about 40% disapproving of his job performance. But less than 5 months later, Biden's approval is down more than 10 points. And voters aren't sounding very optimistic that things are going to get any better either. About 26% now saying that the country is generally headed in the right direction, 58% saying it's on the wrong track. That according to a YouGov poll this week. The same poll gave Biden just 40% approval overall. And here may well be the Afghanistan effect, just 34% expressing confidence now in Biden's ability to handle an international crisis. 60% say Biden is a very or somewhat weak leader, and that is very, very bad for America's commander-in-chief. The one saving grace for Biden in this poll may be that he is still fairly well liked, or at least he inspires enough ambivalence. Almost 40% say they like him a lot or somewhat as a person, 17% are indifferent, 35% dislike Joe Biden, 9% are unsure. So just over a third of voters taking an active dislike to Biden could be his salvation. Meanwhile, congressional Democrats facing midterm elections in just over 12 months will be somewhat cheered, perhaps, by their 8-point lead in the YouGov generic congressional ballot. Although, in the average of congressional polls, it is still a much, much tighter race, Chaz.
Yeah, and for what's worth, Quinnipiac has congressional Republicans ahead by 3, whereas only a month ago, Democrats were ahead by 4 in the same poll. So, and it's true that when a president faces a slump, their numbers fall across the board. So we should bear that in mind with what I'm about to say. But there are a few results that I think are worth focusing on anyway. From July to October, Biden's approval amongst independents dropped from 62% to 38%, a fall of 24 points. That is not normal. Even worse, his approval amongst black people has fallen from 86% to 64%. Remember, Biden won both the 2020 primaries and the general election on the back of black turnout. So that looks like a flashing red siren to me. Another key plank of Biden's 2020 argument was that he knew what he was doing. He'd been there, done that. No more Trump administration chaos. Well, according to Quinnipiac, only 42% of people now regard Biden's administration as competent in running the government. That is not a very high number for what is supposed to be your strength. And that might be why things went south so quickly for Biden in August, John. There were a few too many disasters all at the same time, and they might have seriously tarnished his major selling point.
Yeah, and a big part of those poll numbers can possibly be explained by another set of numbers. While COVID infections, hospitalisations and deaths have been going down pretty strongly in recent weeks, winter is just around the corner and those good numbers may not be going to last.
Yeah, we're already starting to see hospitalisations falling in the south where it's warm going into winter and rising in the north where it's cold going into winter. But for now, cases have fallen nationally to about 90,000 new cases a day. Hospitalisations are now below 60,000 and deaths have fallen a bit too in the 1,500 a day region. Nevertheless, America has passed a rather grim milestone, 353,000 COVID deaths reported this year. That's now past the number of COVID deaths from last year before the vaccine. And that was also over a 10-month period. So we're comparing apples with apples there. As far as state cases go, if we combine Australian and American states, like we do, Alaska is way out ahead with 111 cases per 100,000 people per day. But then there's a rapid drop-off. Victoria has raced up over the last few weeks to number 33, way ahead of where New South Wales was and just past Texas, would you believe? And New South Wales has dropped right off the chart. To vaccines, and America has maintained about 800,000 to 900,000 doses a day. Not really enough. The New York Times projects that if America continues at this rate, they won't hit 70% of the population with at least one dose until December 17. That's where Australia is right now. As for 85% receiving at least one dose, that's what people guesstimate is the herd immunity range. That's in July next year. Meanwhile, a bunch of countries have flown right past America. Out of the countries that have had at least 1 million doses of vaccine, America is now number 45 in the world for the percentage of its population that's fully vaccinated. Australia, by the way, at number 52, just about to pass America next week, I would expect. Even though back when we were 5% fully vaccinated, America was 45% fully vaccinated. We're about to pass them anyway, which leads us to our much missed state comparison stats. So this is the percentage of each state's total population that has received at least one shot. If we combine all 56 American and Australian states, Vermont is still the most vaccinated, but New South Wales is now number 10, only 6% behind. Victoria has shot up to number 15 and Tasmania number 22. Then you got South Australia, Western Australia and Queensland all ahead of at least 15 American states. As far as the fully vaccinated percentages go, pretty similar. New South Wales is number 10 here as well. Then Tasmania still in the 20s. Victoria is in the 30s here. And the other three states down the bottom of the table in the Idaho zone. Hopefully they won't remain in the Idaho zone for long, but it's because the Idaho zone still exists that a number of states, businesses and the federal government have begun pushing various kinds of vaccine mandates. And at least so far, they seem to be doing okay. One group studied 17 large companies where vaccine-related resignations had occurred, found that all but 3 of them experienced under 1% vaccine-related turnover. So not too many sackings so far. CNBC surveyed 35 major CFOs. They found 80% of them totally supporting vaccine mandates. But it's not America if there isn't resistance. And in Texas, Governor Greg Abbott has issued an executive order banning any entity in Texas, private or otherwise, from imposing an employee vaccine mandate. This despite his spokesperson a few months back declaring that private businesses don't need government running their business. Apparently now they do. And also despite a recent poll finding 65% of Texans supporting vaccine mandates. Florida is resisting as well, although the most interesting resistance has actually come from one of the Black Lives Matter leaders in New York, who declared that the New York mayor was targeting black people with his vaccine mandate because 72% of black people aged 18 to 44 in New York are unvaccinated. Interesting to see if that goes anywhere, John. Yep. Also interesting to see if these vaccine mandates make any real difference to America's overall vaccine numbers, because they need it.
Yeah, indeed. So beyond the COVID numbers and the top-line polls, what are voters thinking and feeling about Joe Biden and the state of the United States right now? Sarah Longwell is a Republican strategist who crossed party lines last year to support Joe Biden over Donald Trump, and she's been conducting focus groups to try and find out what is on voters' minds. Sarah Longwell, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Sarah, how do you think American voters are feeling right now, particularly their feelings towards President Biden?
You know, they're kind of frustrated with Joe Biden. And I would say if I had to give kind of a top-level analysis about why that is, I think it's COVID. People expected to feel like we were going to be further along than we currently are. We're still having a lot of supply chain disruption. People are worried about inflation. People are still having fights over mask mandates in schools. And so the words that people use when I ask them, how do you think things are going in the country? They say things like slow, stuck. And so there's just kind of this feeling of overall, I wish more was happening. And I think some of that too is reflected in just the current politics of Washington. This happens sometimes, right? There were people were really excited to get rid of Donald Trump. And I will say, I haven't met a swing voter or a Democratic voter or an independent Biden voter yet who says that they wish that they'd voted for Donald Trump instead. Everybody's glad they voted for Biden. They're glad Donald Trump is gone. I think they just wish things were moving a little more quickly, and that more than anything else, we were kind of out of this COVID situation that we still find ourselves in.
Now, Sarah, while a lot of your work is about Democrats, you mentioned independents there, and I'm kind of interested in them because obviously they're important and their support for Biden has dropped precipitously. So what's going on with the independents in particular?
Yeah, so I have done groups all across the political spectrum. I actually did a group of independent Joe Biden voters in Wisconsin just this week. And, they actually were slightly better than the group of Democratic voters from Pennsylvania that I had done sort of the week before. The focus group from Pennsylvania really was dire. Most of those voters were giving Joe Biden a C or a C minus. The independent group from Wisconsin, there was a little more B, mostly B's, some C's mixed in there. But again, the thing that I heard from the independents, and they were incredibly clear about this, they said, where is Joe Biden? Where is Kamala Harris? We feel like this is a really important crisis we're living through. This is a really big moment in time, and we want to see and hear from our leaders. There was this moment in the beginning of the summer where people got their vaccines and they were feeling really good. And then as Delta kind of crept back into the conversation, and pretty soon you were back to seeing the headlines about hospitals being overwhelmed. People were refusing to get vaccinated. There was the, pretty chaotic pullout of Afghanistan. And it just contributed to people going from feeling really optimistic, like we were about to turn the corner, to kind of shoving people back into that COVID mindset. And so there's this malaise that kind of hangs over people, whether it's Democrats, whether it's independents, whether it's Republicans. People just don't feel like America's back, and that's what they wanted.
Sarah, you mentioned the M word there, malaise, a term, of course, associated for all history with President Jimmy Carter, even though Vietnam wasn't his fault, Watergate wasn't his fault, hyperinflation and the oil crisis was not Jimmy Carter's fault. He ended up carrying the can for all of those things, and he had a failed one-term presidency. Are you saying that's where Joe Biden's headed?
I think that's premature. I think that there's still a lot of time for Joe Biden to turn these things around. I think what we're hearing in the focus groups should be red flags, especially the piece around people not knowing what are in these big bills. I think that the White House has got to get really proactive about their messaging. One thing that you saw from Republicans back when Donald Trump ran, and he ripped off a bunch of executive orders soon after taking office. And, Republicans would sort of fan out and be very deliberate, saying, well, he moved the embassy to Jerusalem, he's cutting red tape, and he's, getting rid of regulations. And they would just really tick through the achievements to kind of pound it into people's brains, because they knew people didn't like Donald Trump personally, so they had to make a big case for him on the policy front. And I think that this administration has really got to get their heads around the fact that they've got to start pushing deliberate messaging about what they're doing for people and making that case aggressively. And they do have time to do it. There's still a year before the midterms. And so I wouldn't be premature about counting Joe Biden out, but I do think people need to take seriously the fact that there is a lot of frustration and that people were hoping things would be better than they are.
And Sarah, almost uniquely for a former president, Donald Trump is going nowhere. He's kind of acting almost more like a leader of the opposition in our kind of a system. So what effect do you think, if any, on Joe Biden's approval rating is the omnipresence of Donald Trump?
Yeah, I don't know. I actually think when Trump is loud and when Trump, puts himself back in the public consciousness, that in many ways is good for Joe Biden. Because as I said, while these swing voters might be frustrated with Joe Biden, none of them regrets getting rid of Trump. And when Trump comes, when he is top of mind for these Democratic voters, it's the one thing that really consolidates that unruly coalition, which is that they all don't like Donald Trump. And I think that Republicans would be wise to keep him as quiet as possible going into 2022. But I'm not sure he can help himself. And I think that is one of the big openings for Democrats for them to exploit. I mean, I think there's a few things that have to go right. Joe Biden has to get COVID under control. He has to have a couple of legislative wins to run on. They have to put up broadly appealing candidates themselves in 2022. But if Donald Trump is putting himself top of mind for American voters, that is bad for Republicans and good for Democrats.
Finally, Sarah, based on your research, what would you say are the items on the president's agenda that he should most focus on passing, or does it not matter as long as he messages better what he's already done?
Well, there's a few things. Number one, I think they should focus as much as possible on getting COVID under control. And I think even if that is Joe Biden leaning further into talking about why the mandates are important, there really is a sense that people want him to take control of this and to be out there relentlessly telling people, get vaccinated, let's get this virus under control, communicating with people about when are we going to see vaccines for kids, when are we going to have more rapid tests so that people feel like they can test themselves cheaply and easily. That is project number one for Joe Biden. I think the second thing is to recognize that there's a lot of people, including in the Democratic coalition, who don't know yet what Joe Biden has done for them. I mean, whether you agree with sort of the big spending packages or not, Democrats, there was certainly a lot in those $2 trillion bills that Democrats can point to that, are materially benefiting people, but you got to go out and message on that hard. And then I think third, you do have to pass something on infrastructure. Joe Biden's put a lot of political capital into it. And even if they simply passed the smaller bill that was bipartisan, where they got 19 Republican votes in the Senate, even if they got that through, I mean, small wins over big swings would go a long way to helping people get back this sense of like, okay, we're moving forward. Things are happening. Things are on track. They're going well. We're moving in the right direction. And I think that's the big thing. You want to change the overall tone and narrative away from this feeling of, hey, we're backsliding, to, hey, we're moving the ball forward.
Sarah Longwell, good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us on Planet America.
Thanks for having me.
Time now for a new segment.
Trump 2024. No, seriously.
What looked vanishingly unlikely just 9 months ago as he was ushered out of the White House like a rowdy drunk at closing time is now looking all but certain. America's 45th president, Donald J. Trump, the only president ever to be impeached twice, has set his sights on becoming just the second president elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. He may not win, but it looks like he's sure going to try. The Washington Post reporting, as turmoil in Afghanistan reached a crescendo in August, Donald Trump began talking again with advisors about whether he should announce his 2024 campaign for president right away. They responded by urging patience, their argument being that if Trump formally declares now, it will limit his fundraising activities and make next year's midterms a referendum on Trump, which is a bit of a risk. So far, Republicans have not done so well in the Trump era when Trump himself is not on the ballot. The Post reporting the arguments won Trump over, for the time being at least. Still, President Trump looking every bit the candidate last weekend when he returned to the first in the nation, Iowa, for a rally at the state fair, which for 50 years has been a rite of passage for presidential hopefuls. The cable news channel C-SPAN certainly thought it was a 2024 campaign event. And as around 20,000 supporters happily munched on corn dogs and deep-fried butter on a stick, Trump continued to spread falsehoods about his 2020 election loss, claiming to have won states he did not win, and Trump again criticised President Biden's handling of the Afghanistan withdrawal.
And I think, to me, Afghanistan is the most embarrassing event in the history of our country. I do think that. And I think that, meaning the withdrawal.
And Trump also riffed for quite a while about the crime rate, including a pretty dire prediction, and then, just for old time's sake, a big dash of xenophobia.
No, it's a terrible thing that's happening. It's sick. Actually, it's sick. And it's only going to lead to the destruction of our country, and other bad things can happen, because I don't think a lot of people are going to take it for much longer. I'll be honest. I don't think they're going to take it. Other countries are emptying their prisons and sending their murderers and drug smugglers and child abusers into the United States.
So a lot of it was pretty familiar. And the Iowa State Fairground has long been a magnet for washed-up acts playing their back catalogue to overweight baby boomers. But In this neck of the woods, it seems Donald Trump is still top of the pops. His poll numbers hit a new high this month. 53% of Iowans approve of Trump. 91% of Iowa Republicans approve of him, as do 48% of independents. And that 91% support amongst Republicans is exactly why Iowa's 88-year-old Senator Chuck Grassley, who is the epitome of the establishment, having served 40 years in the US Senate and wants to be elected to another 6 years in the Senate, he is courting Trump's endorsement, and he got it. Although the teleprompter may have ruined the shot for any TV ads that Chuck was wanting to cut.
You are the greatest. Look at this. He's young. I'm thrilled to announce tonight that Senator Chuck Grassley has my complete and total endorsement for re-election. Chuck.
Auto cue aside those images, curmudgeonly old Chuck Grassley sucking up to Donald Trump 9 months after Grassley himself had to be whisked out of the US Capitol building in the face of a deadly pro-Trump mob. Kind of says it all. Back then, old Chuck said that Trump displayed poor leadership in his words and actions, and he must take responsibility. Here's what he said this week.
If I didn't accept the endorsement of a person that's got 91% of the Republican voters in Iowa, I wouldn't be too smart. I'm smart enough to accept that endorsement.
Well, to be fair, he ain't lying. It was very telling. Grassley open about the fact that he wants Trump's supporters. He's not defending Trump. He's not praising Trump. He's just taking his endorsement, acknowledging for the time being, though, that Donald Trump still holds the reins of the Republican Party. It's the same calculation that Grassley and the other Republicans made in 2016, and we all saw how that worked out. A president whose own staff treated him like a dangerous toddler, whose top officials described him as a moron, who then bungled the response to the pandemic and spruiked fake cures, yet somehow retained this deep connection with many voters. So many of them in Iowa, despite everything, including his unprecedented and baseless claims of a stolen election. Right now, the party of Lincoln and Reagan, Chaz, is still very much the party of Donald Trump.
Absolutely. The Republican nomination is his if he wants it. This week, Morning Consult found while only 35% of total voters wanted Trump to run again, 67% of Republicans did. 47% of Republicans nominated Trump as their preferred candidate as well in the primaries, miles ahead of Mike Pence and Ron DeSantis, with the rest polling spare change. Now, you might think, well, he's only on 47%. That's not a majority. You might also point out that a recent Pew poll found only 44% of Republicans wanted Trump to run for president, and as many as 32% of Republicans wanted Trump to not even remain a major national political figure. But even if Trump only got 44% of the vote, that's still an easy primaries win. That's better than he did in 2016. Besides, no one serious is going to run against Trump. Let me show you why I think that. The Hill ran a hit piece on Trump just this week about how almost all Senate Republicans are hoping that Trump does not announce his intention to run again for president. Yet despite the supposed stampede of pessimistic Republicans, every senator that the Hill spoke to requested anonymity to criticise Trump. They're afraid of him. And if they're too scared to say something negative about Trump in the Hill, they're sure as hell not going to take him on in a primary, John. It's his.
Yeah, looks like it. And now to World War III, or at least what seems at the moment to be the more likely start of it, because tensions continue to rise between the United States and China over a range of issues, with Taiwan the potential flashpoint. In September, President Biden and President Xi held their first direct talks in 7 months at what experts called one of the lowest points in the relationship between the two countries in decades. That 90-minute phone call seems to have paved the way for this week's announcement of an agreement in principle for a virtual bilateral, or what you and I would describe as a Zoom call, Chaz, between the two leaders. That's going to happen later in the year. In recent weeks, China has been sending a conspicuous number of military aircraft very close to Taiwan, which it considers a renegade province of China. And President Xi has been talking about unification, adding peaceful means is most in line with the overall interests of the Chinese nation, including the Taiwan compatriots. So he's not ruling out less than peaceful means right there. And that does help to explain why America is keen for allies like Australia to lift their defensive game with things like nuclear-powered submarines, much to Beijing's consternation. Taiwan, meanwhile, is worried. They believe that China could mount a full-scale invasion as soon as 2025.
America is worried as well, John. Back in March, the then commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, Philip Davidson, testified that taking Taiwan was one of China's ambitions and that he thought the threat from China could come in the next 6 years. In fact, America has been so worried about China's designs on Taiwan that they sent a small number of Marines to train the Taiwanese in small boat defence. They've been there for at least a year, at least until they were exposed last week. Awkward.
Yeah. Now, it's fair to say that Taiwan's status is a little bit complicated, even in Taiwan itself. Some political leaders claim independence, others autonomy from China's. Others still claim to be the rightful rulers of mainland China itself. For more than 20 years after the communist takeover in China in 1949, most countries still recognise the nationalists who fled to Taiwan as the legitimate rulers of the mainland. But since the 1970s, the United States and countries like Australia have recognised the communist-led People's Republic of China as China. At the same time, the United States also maintains relations with the people of Taiwan and the Taiwanese government. It is all deliberately very ambiguous, and it has long been assumed that the United States would help Taiwan defend itself from communist Chinese attack, dissuading China from even trying by giving them a lot of military aid. This week, President Biden said something interesting.
Well, I've spoken with Xi about Taiwan. We agree, we'll abide by the Taiwan agreement. That's where we are. And we made it clear that I don't think he should be doing anything other than abiding by the agreement.
Well, that's a relief, Chaz. But what is the Taiwan agreement? Well, officially, there is no Taiwan agreement. So, was that a Joe Biden gaffe? Did he tip his hand on a secret deal? Or is he just talking about that ambiguous status quo?
Some think that he's referring to the Taiwan Relations Act. That was a law passed in 1979, but doesn't really help much because that supposedly maintains peace, security and stability in the Western Pacific by maintaining friendly commercial, cultural and other relations. In other words, it also means absolutely nothing. So, I don't know. Should we ask someone smart what's going on?
Very good idea. Joining us is Bonnie Lin, Director of the China Power Project at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. She's also a former advisor on China and Taiwan in both the Obama and Trump Defence Departments. Dr. Bonnie Lin, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and glad to be here.
When President Biden talked this week about both sides sticking to the Taiwan agreement when there isn't one, what do you think he actually meant?
I think what President Biden meant was that the United States continues to adhere to the U.S. One China policy. I don't think in any way he meant that there is a new agreement on Taiwan or there's a new U.S. policy on Taiwan. The U.S. policy for Taiwan largely remains the same. And I think what the Chinese wanted to hear from that was that the United States does not take a position, for example, on the merits of China's one country, two systems approach. The United States does not support Taiwan's independence. And along with what I was mentioning, the continuity of the U.S. One China policy, it's still that the United States insists on a peaceful resolution of the cross-strait differences and imposes any unilateral change of status quo by either side.
Dr. Lin, according to the outgoing commander of the US Indo-Pacific Command, China is likely to attack Taiwan within 6 years. Do you agree?
Personally, I'm not sure I agree. And I think there is quite a bit of nuance to Admiral Davison's statement. So I think what he was talking about was that China might have the capability by 2027 to launch a potential successful invasion of Taiwan. I am more of the statement, more in line of what General Milley, basically chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, his statement was, it might be possible that China reaches some level of capability by 2027, but that is not necessarily the same as having intent to invade. And so his statement was more or less of a much more caveated, nuanced perspective on looking at where China might be with respect to Taiwan.
I mean, Doctor, that almost sounds like saying, oh, you know, in a few years from now, China will have a gun at your head, but don't worry, they're not going to pull the trigger. Is that what it's like?
President Xi Jinping in China has a variety of goals that he wants to achieve during his term. A number of these goals include, for example, domestic economic agenda, some of his domestic political reforms that he wants to push through. And for President Xi, engaging in a conflict, particularly an invasion of Taiwan, is incredibly risky. It will be incredibly costly politically, economically, and militarily, and it could undermine what he tries, what is, in my perspective, more important for him, his domestic goals.
So, if some time way off in the future China was to attack Taiwan, what should America do?
So if you look at the state of U.S.-Taiwan relations, the United States is Taiwan's strongest defense supporter and backer. The United States also has a very robust and deep relationship with Taiwan. And if you look at recent polling from the United States, we are now seeing that over 50% of the U.S. public support U.S. defending Taiwan from a Chinese invasion. So while we can't really know for sure what the U.S. reaction might be, I think it would probably be fair to say that the United States is very invested in Taiwan. We have devoted significant military planning and military capability to defense of Taiwan. And we also have the domestic support to support Taiwan now.
Thinking about this from Taiwan's perspective for a second, how should Taiwan react to China flying sorties in its airspace literally every second day?
So I think Taiwan's initial response to this increasingly almost daily incursion from the PLA into its air defense identification zone was to scramble fighter jets and scramble aircraft in order to intercept Chinese intrusions. What Taiwan has found over time is that becomes very draining on its readiness, and it might not necessarily be the best use of its aircraft. And it becomes relatively asymmetric in the sense that if China takes an action, then Taiwan necessarily has to respond. So what Taiwan is doing now is relying more on ground-based assets to track and monitor intruding Chinese aircraft. Because right now, China is still pretty cautious when it comes to flying into Taiwan's ADIZ. Most of Chinese flights are concentrated in the southwest corner of Taiwan's ADIZ. But there's a lot more that China can do, including flying closer to Taiwan, flying to the east side of Taiwan, but also directly flying over Taiwan. And that's where things become a bit trickier in terms of how Taiwan should respond.
Dr. Lin, during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, there were a number of concerns. One was whether one side thought that there was the prospect of them winning an intentional war. But then, arguably, the greater concern was that a war could be triggered accidentally, that something could go wrong, a miscommunication, and suddenly the war is on. Is there room for such a miscalculation here between China and the United States? If so, what would that nightmare scenario look like to you?
If China, for example, decides to move closer and make those incursions larger, more frequent, and potentially more aggressive, there is a real risk that Taiwan pilots or Taiwan's Air Force might view some of the Chinese activities as having hostile intent. Then it becomes a question of, does Taiwan either aggressively intercept or force the Chinese aircraft to land? Or maybe in a worst case scenario, does Taiwan shoot down the Chinese aircraft, or there might be a collision between the Taiwan and Chinese aircraft? In that case right now, I don't think it would necessarily immediately spark a China-Taiwan war, and necessarily from that wouldn't it necessarily be a U.S.-China conflict. But I do think we don't necessarily have the existing crisis communication channels between China and Taiwan to properly manage that. And there is a risk that on both sides of the strait, a significant national sentiment could complicate any way in which both sides might seek to de-escalate that.
Dr. Bonnie Lin, good to talk to you. Thanks for being with us on Planet America.
Thank you very much.
Oh, doesn't that look cosy? Let's have a fireside chat, Chaz. Lots to catch up on over the last couple of weeks since we were last on the air, including some important developments in the Texas abortion case. In case you forgot, that is the law that was introduced in Texas, effectively outlawing abortions, including in cases of rape and incest, after 6 weeks pregnancy. And we knew a couple of weeks ago the courts were going to get involved. They have.
They have been involved, and they've been changing their minds every couple of days. We've had situations where we've had days where the law has been upheld, days where the law there's been an injunction placed on it. At the moment, I believe it's in action right now. But any day it could be, the injunction could be placed on it again.
Yes, exactly. So as a result, a lot of abortion providers in Texas, because this law has a retrospectivity about it, which allows for private citizens to get involved and to get a $10,000 bounty for dobbing in an abortion provider, it means that, well, my understanding is, from reports on the ground, nobody's really providing abortion services to anyone more than 6 weeks pregnant at the moment because they don't want to take that risk.
Yeah, it's interesting because in America, they have a very low rate of medicated abortions. When I say by taking pills, like that's 40% basically in America, whereas in countries like Europe, or continents like Europe, it's closer to 100% medicated abortion. So you might see in Texas, even though it's strictly speaking illegal to do that as well, people buying pills through the internet.
Just wait until that issue gets drawn into the prescription drug prices debate. Are abortion pills going to be subsidised by the government, they'll be asking.
One very quick thing before we move on though. It's really interesting that in the last 3 months, the percentage of Democrats who regard abortion as a very important issue has shot up from the mid-30s, over 50%. Republicans has gone down from the 40s down to 35%. So now it's actually a bigger issue for Democrats than for Republicans. And depending on what the Supreme Court do in the next year or so, this could become the issue for Democrats in the midterms.
Yeah, for sure. And the Virginia governor's race, which voting has already started in that as well. So that's definitely a live issue. The January 6th Commission, the investigation into the pro-Trump riot at the Capitol building, that's also tied up in the courts at the moment. The commissioners, Democrat-dominated committee, have been issuing subpoenas to people who were around Donald Trump and in the Justice Department. At the time, Trump from Florida is saying, executive privilege, don't go and talk to them. Some have not, and those who have not, like Steve Bannon, may end up in court.
Yeah, now generally it's not the right of an ex-president to say executive privilege, it's the right of the current president to decide whether it's executive privilege. Trump is asserting it and he's going to go to the court and try and get the courts to side with him. Steve Bannon is a critical example because most of the people involved were working for Trump at the time when he was president, and so that's a logical argument to say that their personal private advice should remain secret. Steve Bannon, he had nothing to do with the government. He was just a dude with a podcast.
He left in 2017.
Yeah, so for him to claim executive privilege, for Trump to claim executive privilege over his communication with Steve Bannon, ridiculous. There's no chance that's going to be upheld by court, but they have to go through the court process. Is that going to take a week? Is it going to take till after the midterms when the Democrats may no longer be in control of the commission? We'll see, but this is going to be a really interesting one. Now the question is, are they going to prosecute him for contempt at the same time as the court case is going forward? Because if they want to play hardball, it's available to them.
The difference, I guess, is it's Joe Biden's Department of Justice that will set up the case against Steve Bannon to decide whether he goes to jail for a year and is fined $100,000, which is the maximum penalty for contempt of Congress in the face of a subpoena like this. And Democrats don't mind if this goes into next year. If they have people around Trump that are getting dragged in front of their committee next year, closer to the midterms, that's good for them. But as you say, if it's after the midterms, no good for them at all.
Absolutely. What might happen as well is it might take about a year for these court cases to go through with Steve Bannon, setting a precedent for less executive privilege, just in time for the Republican Congress to then investigate Joe Biden, both now and after he's president.
What goes around comes around. And just quickly as well, as a bit of economic data has come out, gas prices, petrol prices are on the way up in the United States. So, even though some of the concerns around inflation, for instance, may have been tempered a little bit, consumer prices are going up. But when people see a 3 in front of their gas prices, a gallon of petrol petrol's now about like $3.20 in somewhere like Florida this week. They're used to it being like $1.60, $1.70.
Yeah, they are. And we shouldn't brush past inflation because it's still 5.4% over last year. We are expecting that to be the case, but it's hanging around there. Let's not forget unemployment figures as well. I think it was 194,000 new jobs, which for America is not very high, especially coming out of a pandemic.
Yep.
Last month was also 235,000, not high. They're hoping for more than 500,000 new jobs every month. So that word that was bandying around before on the show, malaise, with that and the gas prices, it's getting a little bit dodgy.
Now, before we go, let's bust some malarkey.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
You better believe it is. Former Republican Congressman and Texas gubernatorial hopeful Alan West is home from hospital today after 3 days of treatment for COVID-19. West, a former Army colonel and Tea Party conservative, was unvaccinated. He's been a vocal opponent of vaccine mandates, and he was taking ineffective and inappropriate drugs like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin in an attempt to prevent COVID. Didn't work. From his hospital bed last weekend, West was continuing to tweet anti-scientific guff about people knowing what's best for their bodies more than doctors. He described vaccines as dangerous shots and boasted that he now had natural immunity because he has COVID. That's science, he tweeted, which is true. It is science, but he would have had that from a vaccine without being hospitalised with pneumonia. And at much less personal risk to his health, West also promoted monoclonal antibody therapies, which, true, can be highly effective. But again, he claimed that they were better than vaccines.
I particularly like how he wrote, instead of enriching the pockets of big pharma and corrupt bureaucrats and politicians with vaccines, we should be advocating the monoclonal antibody infusion therapy. Okay, so that's even though vaccines cost $25 a dose,
yes,
and monoclonal antibodies cost thousands of dollars that go straight to big pharma.
Go figure that. Once he was sent home, Alan West remained Trumpily unrepentant.
Do not fear COVID. And just remember, as it says in Joshua chapter 1 and 9, be strong and of good courage. For the Lord their God shall never leave you nor forsake you. Put everything in his hands and he will carry you through it.
I fear sandals with jeans. It is malarkey, Chaz. Now, you may think Alan West just another kook. Perhaps so, but he is being taken very seriously, at least seriously enough as a rival to the incumbent Republican Greg Abbott in Texas that just signed that executive order you mentioned earlier in the program, tacking hard right on vaccines, barring any entity in the state, including private businesses, imposing a vaccine mandate.
Yeah, that's true. Talking about vaccine mandates, Biden thought he'd scored a cute hit on Fox News the other day about their vaccine mandate.
This I always get a kick out of. Fox News. Fox News requires vaccinations for all employees. Give me a break, Fox News.
He even pulled out the whisper. But unfortunately, he muffed it up. Fox News does not require their employees to get vaccinated, but they do have a mandate that's still strict. Either you get vaccinated or you get tested daily, not weekly like Biden's proposed rule requires. So the Fox mandate is indeed stricter than Biden's, which of course is Biden's point. Fox hosts accuse his mandate of being dictatorial without saying boo about their own employer's mandate. But anyway, he screwed up the landing, so Tucker Carlson responded.
As a factual matter, what Joe Biden just said is completely untrue. It is a lie, period. We can say that with authority since we work here. Every day, literally alone among big media outlets, Fox News defends this country's most basic civil liberties, what we used to refer to as the Bill of Rights. To cynical authoritarians like Joe Biden and the ghouls around him like Susan Rice, that just can't be genuine. They assume the people you see on Fox News must be pretending for money or prestige or ratings or something else. But they are wrong. We are not pretending at all. It's real.
Very passionate, very real. Also very interesting how Tucker didn't find the time to mention what Fox's actual policy is. I wonder why he left that out. I think that deserves a sting. Now look, to be fair, Tucker isn't necessarily being a hypocrite there. You could just be against government mandates. But then why have Fox had people rejecting non-Biden mandates on as guests 30 times in 2 months, including 3 non-Biden mandate rejectors on the very night that Tucker clip aired, one of them on Tucker's show. Now, you might say Fox isn't forcing you to get vaccinated, though. You can be tested instead, right? Well, that's exactly the same as Biden's mandate, but Tucker still said Joe Biden's orders forcing 100 million Americans to take the COVID shot. So one way or another, there is malarkey in these orders.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
By the way, if Tucker does want to be genuine, maybe he should be a little more transparent. And when people ask him if he's been vaccinated, he shouldn't respond with, "When was the last time you had sex with your wife and in what position? We can trade intimate details." I mean, look, I get his point, but I reckon none of your business left the train station about 85 Tucker Carlson vaccine editorials ago.
I don't think he's making a point. I just think he wants to know the answer to that question as well. That is it for another trip to Planet America. We will be back at the same time next week. You can catch up whenever you like as well on ABC iView, YouTube and Facebook.
Sadly, no pep podcast for the peppers out there, but there will be one very soon. You just stay tuned.
Bye-bye.